So, you want to get clean in the Middle Ages? Bold move. You stroll into a bathhouse expecting a steamy, spa-like oasis. But what you find instead, buckets of tepid water, a chorus of burping townsfolk, and a guy named Ulrich scrubbing his armpits with sand. Oh, and don't mind the rats, or the syphilis. Because medieval bathhouses weren't just about bathing, they were social clubs, gossip mills, brothels, and microbial zoos, all rolled into one. Ready to strip down, lather up, and maybe catch the plague. Great, let's get uncomfortably clean. If you're already squirming in your seat, or tub, hit that subscribe button. We'll be your rubber duckies in the filthiest corners of forgotten history. You know you're curious. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Please leave your modern assumptions and deodorant at the door. Take a breath. No, really. Inhale deeply. That's the delicate bouquet of mud, manure, body odor, and regret. A scent so iconic, it could have been bottled and sold under the label Odor Plague. This isn't the romanticized medieval world of candle-lit banquets and knightly chivalry. This is the real thing. 14th century daily life, where hygiene wasn't just optional, it was almost mythical. Now, before we judge too quickly, let's remember, cleanliness is a moving target. And in medieval Europe, it was, let's say, flexible. In a village with pigs wandering the streets, chamber pots emptied directly onto the road, and an actual job title called gong farmer. We'll get to him later. The concept of clean was more of a vibe than a measurable state. Dirt was everywhere, on your feet, under your nails, in your soup. In fact, if you weren't a little crusty, people might assume you were either suspiciously vain or French. Let's set the scene. You're a peasant. Congratulations. So is 90% of the population. You live in a timber-framed hut that leaks when it rains and smokes when it doesn't. You sleep on straw that's been hosting a convention for fleas, and your only toilet is a hole in the ground that freezes over in winter. As for bathing, that depends on your proximity to a stream, your tolerance for hypothermia, and how many days it's been since your neighbor's cow died in the water upstream. Soap? Technically it exists, but you won't see it unless you're rich, or a monk, or somehow both. Even then, soap was made with animal fat and lye, and often smelled worse than what it was supposed to wash off. Most people resorted to sand, ash, or brace yourself, urine. Yes, urine, not just for peeing anymore. It had ammonia, which weirdly does clean things, including your dignity. But let's not oversimplify. The idea that nobody bathed in the Middle Ages is a myth, often repeated by those who've never tried going without a shower for 3 days at a music festival. In reality, medieval people wanted to be clean, they just didn't have the infrastructure, or, plumbing. So they made do. Wealthier households might have a wooden tub, some monasteries had full-blown bathhouses. Even peasants sometimes took a dip in the river, preferably upstream from where the livestock drank. Still, cleanliness was tied to more than just health. It was spiritual, symbolic, and, in many cases, seasonal. That's right, seasonal bathing. Spring cleaning took on a whole new meaning when it was also your first bath since October. There are even accounts of people bathing for important events like weddings, funerals, or because the lice were winning. This raises an important question. How did anyone survive this microbial minefield? Well, immunity, mostly. Medieval immune systems were like steel traps. If you made it past the age of 5 without being taken out by dysentery, you were practically invincible, and people got used to the smell. It was the scent of familiarity, of home, of that one guy in the village who always wore the same tunic and smelled like boiled onions. And speaking of smells, let's talk about body odor. Today, a whiff of armpit sends us sprinting to the nearest antiperspirant. But back then, scent was status. If you smelled like herbs, people assumed you were rich. If you smelled like garlic, you were probably a laborer. And if you smelled like wet goat, well, you might be a wet goat. It was the original form of social networking. Instead of LinkedIn, people just sniffed each other. Now, if you're wondering what the official rulebook said about all this, here's where it gets even better. There wasn't one. Hygiene was a weird mix of folklore, religion, and sheer guesswork. People believed that bad smells carried disease, and sometimes they were right. But they also believed that too much bathing could make you vulnerable to miasmas, or evil vapors that entered through your skin, so they often opted to seal their pores with layers of dirt. Science. And yet, despite all of this, bathhouses thrived. Wait, what? Yes. Bathhouses. Public ones. Communal, steamy, and surprisingly popular. So popular in fact that they were the medieval version of a Starbucks one on every corner, some better than others, and all slightly overpriced. People gathered there not just to wash, but to gossip, flirt, do business, and sometimes do each other. Which brings us to the real paradox. If most people didn't have soap, didn't have plumbing, and were vaguely suspicious of water, why were public baths all the rage? Well, that's where things get sudsy. So, you've made peace with the fact that your medieval hygiene routine involves sand, spit, and a prayer. You're living in a world where dirt is personality, and your best friend is a lice comb. But then, someone whispers two magical words: public bathhouse. Now don't get excited. This isn't a luxury spa with eucalyptus towels and ambient whale noises. It's more like a moist community centre, where everyone's naked, nothing is private, and the water is doing its best impression of human soup. Welcome to the stew. Bathhouses in medieval Europe were everywhere. If you were in a town, especially one with Roman roots, odds are there was a bathhouse within shouting distance of your plague doctor. They went by many names. In England, stews. In Germany, Badstube. In France, étuve. In all languages, they roughly translated to a place where modesty goes to die and fungal infections go to thrive. Now, the word stew didn't refer to food. Not unless your idea of dinner involves floating toenails and the gentle musk of boiled strangers. It described the shared water, warm, cloudy, and by the time you arrived, well seasoned with the bodily offerings of everyone who came before you. Think of it as human crock-potting. You didn't just take a bath, you marinated. But let's talk structure. What did these bathhouses actually look like? Picture a low, timbered building, often with a sloped roof and a puff of steam rising from the chimney like a warning flare. Inside, you'd find multiple rooms, a changing area, barely separated, a warm room like a sauna but louder, and the main bath, a giant wooden or stone tub big enough to fit half the village and most of their anxieties. No plumbing, of course. Water was hauled in by hand or from nearby wells, heated in massive iron cauldrons over open flames, then dumped into the tub, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with oils, occasionally with bits of old wood and forgotten underpants. The walls dripped with condensation, the floors were permanently wet, and everything had the faint squelch of mildew. Oh, and the lighting. Candlelight if you were lucky. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed seeing your neighbours in the moody shadows of a flickering tallow candle. There's nothing quite like making prolonged eye contact with your butcher while you both sit shirtless in lukewarm water trying to pretend this is totally normal. Monastic bathhouses were slightly different. Monks, for all their vows of poverty, loved a good soak. Their facilities were usually more orderly, cleaner, quieter, and less likely to result in syphilis. But even in monasteries, bathing was communal. Humility, after all, is best practiced while your fellow friar exfoliates his calluses next to you. Then there were elite bathhouses, reserved for nobles. These were as lavish as medieval plumbing could get. Private tubs, imported oils, servants to wash your hair and massage your feet. It was a performance, a display of wealth, as much as cleanliness. But for everyone else, the public bathhouse was equal parts hygiene and chaotic social mixer. Bathhouses weren't just where you bathed. They were where you lived out your small-town drama. This was the medieval version of the local pub, the gym, and the therapist's office combined. People negotiated business deals between rinses. Women exchanged gossip over hair washing. And yes, sometimes things escalated. But more on that later. If you're imagining medieval folks sitting quietly in the steam, politely nodding, and saying things like, "My, what a fine lather, let me stop you right there." These places were loud, boisterous. Think a gym locker room collided with a Renaissance fair. You'd hear laughter, arguments, flirtations, grumbles, and the occasional splash followed by someone yelling, "That was my sponge." Bathhouses were often co-ed. That's right, men and women shared space. Not always, and not everywhere, but often enough to make the church uncomfortable and the town midwives busy. Some bathhouses tried to enforce modesty, others leaned in. If you were looking for a discreet place to bathe and not make eye contact with the local blacksmith, you were in the wrong tub, and hygiene wasn't even the top selling point. For many, bathhouses were about warmth. Homes were cold. Tubs were rare, firewood was expensive, but for a small fee, you could sit in a hot room, soak your joints, and pretend for 15 glorious minutes that you weren't living in a drafty wooden box full of beetles. In fact, bathhouses were often open all night. Some even offered meals, bread, cheese, beer, which you could enjoy in the bath, soaking in your own broth, while eating with your wet hands. Hygiene theatre at its finest. Is it still considered clean if you're chewing mutton stew while stewing in mutton people? Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this arrangement. Town officials worried about noise, the church worried about nudity, doctors worried about disease, and regular people, they mostly worried about someone else's foot touching theirs under the water. A fair concern. Let's also remember that bathhouses were rarely pristine. Towels weren't washed between uses. Water wasn't drained until it absolutely had to be. One English record describes bathwater so murky you couldn't see the bottom. That might not sound awful until you remember that the bottom includes old rags, loose toenails, and the occasional rat. Yet, people kept going, week after week, winter or summer, because for all its biological horrors, the bathhouse served a need deeper than cleanliness. It was connection, ritual, community, a rare place where everyone, rich or poor, sat in the same tub of grime and stared into the same rising steam. So yeah, you didn't just undress your body here, you undressed your secrets. So you've taken the plunge. You've entered the stew. You're now partially submerged in a communal tub that smells like chamomile and disappointment. Congratulations. But the real fun is only just beginning. Because medieval bathing wasn't just about soaking. It was a ritual, a process, a theatrical act of semi-sanitation that would make even your high-maintenance skincare influencer cry into their toner. Let's start with the basics. There is no faucet, no handle you can turn to summon hot water from the depths of indoor plumbing. Instead, you bring your own bucket. Or, if you're lucky, pay someone else to haul it for you. That water is fetched from a river, well, or pond, filtered through prayer and hope, and then dumped into a large cauldron to heat over open flames. If you're feeling particularly fancy, maybe you toss in a handful of herbs. If you're not, congratulations, it now smells like boiled sock. Once the water's warm, read, not scalding or frozen, it's poured into the shared tub, which already contains the half-washed hopes and dreams of everyone who beat you there. Some bathhouses had attendants who stirred the water, like soup. Others just let nature take its cloudy course. Either way, the experience is less refreshing dip and more lukewarm people tea. Now the rituals. Medieval bathing wasn't as random as it sounds. There was actually a method to the madness, or at least a sequence. You didn't just dunk and dash. You arrived, undressed, sometimes with all the subtlety of a stag party, and entered a steam room first. Basically a makeshift sauna with stone walls and the humidity of a mouth. Here's where things got sweaty. The steam was thought to open your pores, purge your sins, and possibly your last remaining brain cells. Some bathhouses had attendants who'd swat you with birch branches to stimulate circulation. Yes, on purpose. No, it wasn't a kink thing. Probably. Once steamed and lightly beaten, you moved to the bath itself. Here, things got more hands-on. Soap was a luxury, but various alternatives were in play. Ashes, lye, fermented urine, the OG shampoo, or herbal scrubs made from sage and thyme. These weren't applied delicately. You were often scrubbed down by a professional bather. Imagine a medieval masseuse with no dental plan and a loofah made of horsehair. Massages were common, so were hair washings, beard oilings, and the occasional toenail extraction. Some bathers would shave their entire bodies, believing it to be cleaner. Others would stop at visible dirt. Many were simply there for the ambience, or to rinse off the illusion of self-respect. It gets weirder. In Germany, there was a tradition: sweat first, soak later. The bathhouses were structured to make you sweat out your impurities in a hot chamber before entering the water. The idea was to make the bath a final rinse, rather than a first line of defense, which, honestly, is more hygiene logic than we've heard from certain modern influencers who drink raw milk in saunas. In France, things leaned more sensual. Baths were perfumed. Oils were used liberally. The French, even back then, had a flair for indulgent cleanliness. though the line between a relaxing rub-down and a legal liability was often left ambiguous. And then there were the English, who thought soap was suspiciously foreign and often opted for just a quick dunk and a vigorous prayer. Some rituals were downright communal. Families would bathe together. Yes, all of them. At once. In the same tub. Starting with the father, then the mother, then the children, then the baby. Then, if water still remained, the neighbour's dog and the local priest. This is where the phrase "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater" becomes a bit too literal for comfort. And if you were travelling, portable tubs were a thing. Wooden barrels, collapsible canvas tubs, even foldable copper contraptions for noblemen who needed to bathe on the go. Picture a royal knight camping on campaign, soaking in a tub while his squire throws herbs at him and stares into the distance, rethinking his career choices. But bathing wasn't just physical, it was also spiritual. In many traditions, especially before weddings or holy days, people would engage in ritual cleansings. These were often done in special pools or blessed tubs, thought to wash away not just grime but sin. Of course, whether that worked depended on how many sins you were trying to drown, and whether your local bath attendant accepted divine currency. And then, of course, there's the social etiquette. Don't hog the soap, if there is any. Don't splash. Don't flirt unless clearly invited. And never, under any circumstances, relieve yourself in the bath. That rule was broken, often, which is why many bathhouses smelled like wet leather dipped in regret. Yet, people still came, for the heat, for the scrub, for the feeling of being momentarily lighter, physically, socially, maybe even emotionally. Bathing became a kind of shared vulnerability, a time when people who spent most of their lives covered in fabric, dirt and stress could shed all of it and sit in the water together, equal parts exposed and cleansed. So with all this scrubbing, steaming, sweating and soaping, a question starts to form like mildew under a bath mat. If bathing was this intense, this layered, this communal and ritualistic, then where exactly did things start to go wrong? And more urgently, if you're bathing with 10 other people, where exactly do you draw the line between friendly and felony? Ah yes, the medieval bathhouse. A warm oasis. A place to unwind, share a jug of wine, swap town gossip, and casually sit in a puddle of bacteria potent enough to write its own death certificate. Because for all its aromatic herbs and community charm, the bathhouse was basically a slow cooker for disease. And not just any disease, we're talking the deluxe, medieval sampler platter, boils, pox, parasites, and our star guest, syphilis. Let's be clear, the idea of germs, not a thing yet. The theory of bad air or miasma reigned supreme. If something smelled rotten, it must be rotten. Which wasn't always wrong, but it also meant people blamed swamp gas and night air while completely ignoring the fact that they were sitting in the same water as Old Man Bartholomew, who was currently leaking something mysterious into the stew. So what exactly happened when you brought dozens of sweaty bodies together into a moist, enclosed space with shared towels, no chlorine, and zero hand sanitizer? Microbial mayhem. Skin infections were common. Boils, rashes, and things with names you're probably not emotionally prepared to Google. You might emerge relaxed, but you'd also pick up a rash that could survive a papal blessing. And then there's syphilis, the most fashionable infection of the late medieval period. It spread fast, hit hard, and made bathhouses its personal playground. When you combine close quarters, questionable moral boundaries, and the fact that condoms at the time were either linen sacks or sheer optimism, you've got a recipe for a population that's itchy, angry, and very much in denial. But the bathhouses just kept going. Because here's the kicker. People thought bathing cured disease. Yes, truly. There were medical manuals from the period that recommended hot baths to treat fevers, melancholia, stomach aches, and wandering wombs. Some doctors believed soaking in mineral springs could balance your humors, cleanse your blood, or flush out impurities through your skin. Which, in their defense, is exactly the kind of logic you invent when your main tools are leeches and guesswork. There were even medicinal bathhouses, complete with herbs like chamomile, mint, and rosemary, tossed in not for scent, but for drawing out bad spirits. In some places people bathed in wine. Yes, wine. Because apparently the real problem with medieval healthcare was that nobody was drunk enough while doing it. And if wine wasn't doing the trick, well, there was always urine. Human urine was considered medicinal. People bathed in it, gargled with it, and even used it to wash their faces. That's not hyperbole, that's just historical documentation we all now have to live with. It was thought to be cleansing, probably because it stung. You know, like truth. Now, not all dangers were microbial. Some were chemical. Early soap making was an inexact science involving animal fat, ash and lye, a combination that, when not carefully balanced, could give you chemical burns that would make your dirt blush in sympathy, and yet people paid for this. Imagine going in for a relaxing wash, and leaving with a layer of second-degree exfoliation. Still, despite the plagues, pustules and skin-melting soap, bathhouses stayed in business. Why? Because they were warm, they were social, and they felt healing. Even if you caught something, at least you caught it while sipping wine, chatting with your neighbors, and sitting in water that could dissolve a hoof. And oddly enough, not all the side effects were terrible. For people suffering from arthritis or chronic pain, the heat helped. Bathing reduced lice. Steam loosened phlegm. Even today, a good soak can do wonders for your mood. Of course, today we also understand bacteria, sterilization, and personal space. 3 things the medieval bathhouse lacked entirely, but they had their own logic. If you feel sick, the logic went, sweat it out, get into the bath, let your pores open, let the heat push the poison from your body, and, if that didn't work, bleed you, or drill a hole in your head. Medical science had range. Meanwhile, bathhouse operators often tried to defend their turf. In some cities, they posted signs warning patrons not to enter if they had visible sores or were marked by plague, which is kind of like putting a no sneezing sign in a daycare and expecting results. Eventually, cities began enforcing regulations. Inspectors would check the water, mandate regular cleaning, and fine bathhouses for unsanitary conditions, though regular cleaning often meant dumping out the water on Sundays and hoping for the best. Let's just say the medieval version of the health department was aspirational. But perhaps the most ironic part of all this is that bathhouses, these hubs of disease and dubious water quality, were also where people went to prevent illness. People genuinely believed they were taking care of themselves, that steam could detoxify, that herbs could purify, that a communal soak could restore balance to a life constantly one step away from starvation, warfare, or being eaten by wolves. It's easy to laugh now, to smirk at the contradictions, but maybe that's the point. Even surrounded by filth, uncertainty and bodily fluids with the consistency of soup, people still reached for comfort, for warmth, for something that made them feel human, even if it came with a side of foot fungus. And yet, not everyone was on board. There was one powerful institution increasingly suspicious of all this skin, steam and social mingling, because if disease didn't get you in the bathhouse, maybe sin would. But the church had other ideas about where evil really lurked, in the water or in your soul. Let's say you're a humble 14th century citizen. You've just had a long day tending crops, dodging rats, and not dying of the plague. Naturally, you want to unwind. You head to the local bathhouse, ready for a warm soak, a bit of gossip, maybe even a loaf of bread in the bath. Life is finally giving you a little steamy comfort. But then you hear the bell, the sermon's starting, and the priest has something on his mind. Something damp, sinful, and suspiciously shaped like your favorite bath bucket, because the church has officially entered the chat. At first, the church wasn't all that bothered by bathing. Early Christianity inherited some practical hygiene habits from the Romans. Monasteries, as we've seen, often had bathhouses built right in, with hot water, regulated bathing schedules, and very pious scrubbing. Cleanliness was next to godliness after all, or at least next to the soup cauldron. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, things got stickier. The public bathhouse had evolved beyond its original purpose. It wasn't just about washing dirt anymore. It was about washing with friends, naked friends, possibly while flirting, possibly while ordering snacks, possibly while questioning one's vow of chastity. In short, the bathhouse had become fun, and fun, according to certain segments of the church, was a theological red flag. It started with suspicion. Clergy began warning that bathhouses encouraged vanity. People were spending too much time grooming themselves, admiring their reflections, oiling their beards. This wasn't humble peasantry anymore. It was personal branding, and worse, it was all happening in a warm, dark room full of partially nude bodies, sliding around on wet benches, It smelled like temptation and mildew. Soon sermons included fiery warnings about immodesty. Bathing became associated with lust, with pride, with indulgence. Suddenly, soap and sin were sharing a dressing room. Church officials condemned co-ed bathing, then mixed-gender staff, then eventually just the whole steaming concept. Better to stink in this life, some monks argued, than burn in the next. Let that sink in. Getting clean was once considered morally dirty. In some cities, laws followed. Bathhouses were shuttered during Lent. Certain hours were designated men only or women only, and clergy were forbidden from attending entirely, a rule that, according to several confession records, was widely ignored. People had a hard time giving up their steam time, even if their immortal souls were technically on the line. Of course, the church's fears weren't entirely unfounded. Many bathhouses had become fronts for brothels. Some were so infamous that they were known by name in court documents, like the Blushing Goose or the Lusty Basin. And if that sounds like something you'd see advertised next to a medieval mead hall, congratulations, you understand the marketing department of. Still, it wasn't just about sex. It was about control. The church saw itself as the guardian of morality, and bathhouses were messy. They were loud, carnal, full of laughter, flesh, stories, and unfiltered human behavior. You couldn't sermonize effectively if your flock was too busy getting exfoliated and buzzed on warm beer. So the church leaned into asceticism. Dirt became a virtue. Saints were praised for avoiding water. Some wore the same robe until it disintegrated. Others lived in caves and let lice feast on them as a form of penance. There's even a record of a particularly pious man who refused to wash his hands ever. He was canonized. His neighbors probably weren't thrilled. Medieval art reflected this too. Paintings of saints often show them with radiant skin, but tattered clothes, dirt-smudged feet, and a facial expression that says, "Yes, I smell like divine rot, and I'm proud of it." Cleanliness was worldly, and the world, as we know, was a hotbed of sin. But not everyone agreed. In cities, bathhouses continued to operate, sometimes legally, sometimes under the table, or under a different name. They became coded spaces. A hot room might actually mean a private bath, with all the bells and whistles, or just a room with really bad ventilation and questionable moral decisions. People got creative. Some bathhouses moved out of town to avoid church oversight. Others added healing language to their advertisements. "Come bathe away your ailments" sounded better than "come soak with strangers while debating theology in your underpants." And let's be honest, medieval folks weren't about to give up the only warm place in town just because Father Gerald said so. When your house is one draft away from becoming an icebox, the bathhouse feels less like luxury and more like survival. Still, the cultural tide was turning. Bathing was no longer universally celebrated. It was being quietly rebranded as either sinful, dangerous, or at best suspicious, especially after the Black Death hit. But we'll get to that little microbial surprise later. The irony: while the church condemned public bathing, many monasteries kept their bathhouses running behind closed cloisters. Cleanliness might be suspicious out there, but within sacred walls, it was still divine. Because of course it was. So what are we left with? A world where being clean was frowned upon, where nudity was a theological crisis, and where the simple act of washing your feet could land you on a sinner's watch list. And yet, bathhouses didn't disappear. Not yet. Not completely. The people, it turns out, were harder to scrub than expected. They still gathered in the steam, still told stories, still sought comfort in the warmth and water. But with the church breathing down their necks, and the bath water slowly clouding with both disease and guilt, something had to give. Next time you enter a bathhouse, just know you might be soaking in both sin and salvation. Let's take a moment and forget the lice. Forget the questionable water quality, the church's passive-aggressive sermons, and the constant threat of catching something that would make your limbs fall off in alphabetical order. Because underneath the grime and theology, the medieval bathhouse was something else entirely. It was the stage. No, not for dramatic plays, though plenty of drama occurred. The bathhouse was where society took off its boots, its layers, its inhibition, and then immediately started judging everyone else. You didn't just clean yourself here, you revealed yourself. Physically, yes, but also socially. Welcome to the most awkwardly intimate social event of the Middle Ages. Let's paint a picture. You walk into the bathhouse. The door creaks, steam rolls out like a dramatic actor entering stage left, and all eyes glance up. You're not just a visitor, you're the entertainment, and depending on your body type, reputation or recent scandal, you might be walking into a cauldron of whispered commentary hotter than the water itself. First, the layout. Most bathhouses had separate areas, changing rooms, loose definition, steam rooms, the central tub, and occasionally private bathing stalls for those who could afford a little solitude. But the main draw was always the communal space. This was where the townsfolk gathered, not just to bathe, but to perform their status. The wealthy arrived with their own towels, embroidered, perfumed, carried by servants. They'd sometimes bathe in shifts, hiring attendants to scrub them with rosewater and imported oils. The poor? They brought a bucket, a hope, and maybe a bar of soap, so old it had developed sentience. Yet inside the bathhouse, the boundaries blurred. Everyone shared the same air, the same steam, the same awkward splash when someone cannonballed into the tub after 3 meads. Gossip flowed like water. Deals were struck. Feuds were whispered behind damp palms. It was the medieval version of a co-working space. If WeWork smelled like wet goat and burn time, women's bathhouses were hubs of social life. This was where alliances formed, insults were sharpened, marriages were arranged, or unarranged. Housewives traded herbal remedies, midwives told stories that doubled as cautionary tales. And if you had a secret, it wasn't safe here. Not unless you shouted it in Latin and hoped no one was educated. Men, on the other hand, treated the bathhouse like a business lunch, where everyone forgot their pants. Nobles made backroom agreements, tradesmen compared calices, and someone, inevitably, brought up taxes. There were even bathhouse musicians, lutanists, flutists, or that one guy who thought he was funny with a goat horn. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it earned him a sandal to the face. And then there was flirting. Yes, it happened. Co-ed bathing was common in many regions, at least until the moral panic wave hit. And even after that, private couples' baths were offered for a fee. Courting rituals involved a little less eye contact and a lot more strategic bubbles. Some bathhouses hired attractive attendants. Others simply relied on the universal appeal of damp, bored townsfolk looking for something to do besides develop trench foot. In fact, so much flirtation happened that cities passed laws forbidding certain behaviors in bathhouses. Vienna banned excessive giggling. Paris fined bathers who engaged in overly familiar massage, and one German town famously outlawed singing in bathhouses because it led to other noises. You didn't just soak here. You negotiated. You reconciled. You retaliated. Old grudges came to the surface. Sometimes literally, if someone accidentally splashed their rival a little too hard. There are accounts of bathhouse brawls breaking out over everything from debt disputes to who stole whose soapstone. But it wasn't all scandal and scrubbing. Bathhouses also served as a kind of democratic space. They were one of the few places where a butcher could sit next to a baron, and no one could hide behind silk or armor. You were stripped bare in every sense, and that paradoxically created something like community. This social stew had rules, of course, unspoken ones. You didn't talk politics unless you were ready for a slap. You didn't touch unless invited. And you never ever criticized someone's hygiene while sharing the same water. Passive-aggressive glances? Fine. Public humiliation? Best saved for market day. Yet, for all their etiquette, bathhouses were chaotic places. Fires sometimes broke out. Tubs cracked. Roofs collapsed mid-soak. There's a 15th century chronicle that describes an entire bathhouse roof falling in while 20 people were inside. No one was seriously injured, but 3 people reportedly kept bathing anyway, because in a world where daily life involved subsistence farming, unpredictable war, and the aforementioned rat problem, the bathhouse offered something unusual: consistency, warmth, familiarity, a place where everyone could be human, and occasionally petty, together. It's easy now to look back and laugh, to mock the steaming puddle of humanity that once passed for public hygiene. But there's something undeniably intimate about it. You didn't just rinse off sweat and sin, you immersed yourself in the rhythms of your town, in its stories, its tensions, its warmth, both literal and emotional. So the next time you settle into your tub with scented salts and Bluetooth speakers, Consider what it meant to bathe back then. It wasn't just about dirt. It was about presence, exposure, connection, a kind of ritual theatre, performed under the watchful eyes of flickering candles and nosy neighbours. And while some saw this as beautiful, others couldn't help but notice the stark contrast. The nobleman soaking in rose oil, the pauper rinsing in runoff, the shared bath, divided by status. Picture a bathhouse at its busiest. The steam curls around timber beams, voices echo in wet stone halls, and somewhere beneath it all, the splash of elbows knocking into strangers creates a rhythm that is, somehow, both soothing and suspicious. Now tilt your gaze slightly, because while everyone's in the same stew, not everyone's bathing the same way. In medieval Europe, cleanliness wasn't just about sanitation. It was about status. If you were rich, and we mean the kind of rich where your boots had soles and your bread didn't have to be scraped for weevils, bathing was a luxury to be choreographed. You didn't walk to a bathhouse. You summoned a bath. Servants would haul in buckets of hot water, pour it into a private wooden tub lined with linen, and sprinkle it with imported herbs or rose petals, not for function but for flex. Soap? Oh yes, not the gritty eyeball-burning lye soap used by peasants, but perfumed bars carved with family crests, probably scented with something like lavender and moral superiority. You might even have a special comb for lice, made of ivory, because nothing says I'm above you like expensive grooming for your parasites. Your bath, as a noble, was an event, a statement. You might receive guests while soaking, clothed attendants dabbing your forehead while a harpist plucks sad notes in the corner. It wasn't about getting clean, it was about being seen getting clean, which, ironically, is still the business model of most spas today. Now, swing the camera to the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum. If you were poor, and let's be honest, most people were, bathing looked very different. You might wash in a river, assuming it wasn't frozen or full of sheep carcasses. You might splash water from a bucket behind your cottage, whispering apologies to your ancestors as you scrubbed with cold ash and anxiety. Soap was rare. Towels, or whatever wasn't already being used as bedding. Privacy was a rumour. And yet, you still went to the bathhouse. Because, despite everything, public bathhouses offered a strange kind of equality. For a small fee, affordable if you skipped lunch or sold a chicken, you could soak in the same tub as a merchant or minor official. The water didn't care how much land you own. The steam didn't recognize your last name. Still, class revealed itself in subtle ways. The rich brought their own linens, soft, white, never shared. The poor used communal towels that hadn't been washed since the last harvest festival. The wealthy arrived with grooming tools, scented oils, and companions. The poor came with a cracked bar of soap and hope. And then there was the bathhouse hierarchy. In some towns, wealthier clients were granted private stalls or access to cleaner tubs. Yes, there were grades of stew. If you paid extra, you got the first pour of hot water, unclouded by human debris. If you didn't, well, enjoy the leftovers. Nothing says social order like rinsing your hair with the same water a tax collector just sneezed in. The stratification extended to staff, too. High-end bathhouses hired attendants trained in massage, grooming, and discretion. They served wine, adjusted temperature, and made sure no one touched the clients, unless invited. Lower-end establishments, let's just say you were lucky if the water didn't already have a toe floating in it. And yet, the bathhouse still functioned as a bizarre social mixing bowl. A baron might sit 2 benches away from a blacksmith. A merchant's wife might chat with a farmer's daughter. For a brief, steamy hour, everyone was reduced to skin and sweat. It was one of the few places where a peasant could sit beside a noble and feel, if not equal, then at least equally pruny. But class tensions didn't evaporate in the steam. They lingered, clung to the walls like mildew. If you talked too loudly, dressed too finely, or splashed the wrong person, you'd get stares, or worse, silence. The kind of cold, judgmental quiet that somehow cuts deeper than a hot bath ever could soothe. And the envy ran both ways. The poor saw how the rich lived, the oils, the servants, the effortless comfort. The rich, meanwhile, glimpsed a world beneath them, one they'd rather not dwell on. There are records of nobles refusing to bathe if commoners were present. Others paid for exclusive hours, ensuring their delicate sensibilities wouldn't be tarnished by someone else's poverty. But every so often, something unexpected happened. Someone shared soap. Someone laughed. A noblewoman complimented a peasant's braided hair. A child splashed water, and both rich and poor laughed, not as lord and labourer but as humans, because beneath the robes, the grime, the etiquette, everyone needed warmth. Everyone carried fatigue in their bones. Everyone wanted, just for a moment, to forget the brutal climb of survival and float, however briefly, in water that didn't care who you were. And that's what made the bathhouse more than a tub. It was a mirror. It showed you who you were, who you weren't, and who you wished you could be. But it also reflected the darker corners, the resentments, the divisions, the slippery slope between civility and something more transactional, because when the lines between wealth, body and power blurred, another type of bathhouse emerged, and in that place, the steam got a little thicker. At some point, someone had to say it, and since no one else will, I will. If you fill a room with hot water, flickering candlelight, bare skin, and zero supervision, things are going to get steamy. And not just from the boiling cauldrons in the back. Welcome to the unwashed truth of the stew bath, where hygiene met hedonism, and your towel did not cover enough to make it innocent. By the late Middle Ages, the bathhouse had officially entered its hotbed of sin era. Literally, the line between public bath and private brothel began to blur so thoroughly that municipal councils spent more time debating bathhouse ethics than fixing actual sewage problems. Priorities. The evolution made a weird kind of sense. Bathhouses were already co-ed in many places, already private in parts, already focused on touch, scrubbing backs, massaging limbs, lathering every crevice that society normally asked you to keep respectfully linen-wrapped. Add a little wine, drop the pretense, and voila, your favorite stew house just started offering full service. Let's not sugarcoat it. Many bathhouses became, to put it diplomatically, multi-purpose. One minute you're being scrubbed with mint oil by someone named Greta. The next minute, she's asking if you'd like a relaxation upgrade. These weren't vague metaphors. Some bathhouses had coded menus packages that included different levels of intimacy, often euphemistically labeled deluxe scrubbing or private heat therapy. City officials tried to regulate it, of course. Some towns required bathhouses to register their workers. Others imposed curfews, forbade mixed bathing during certain hours, or required attendants to be the same gender as their clients. These efforts were about as effective as throwing a soap bubble at a wildfire. Because the truth is, people knew. Everyone knew. Some bathhouses didn't even pretend. They were plastered with signs promising warmth, comfort, and private companionship. One establishment in 15th century Nuremberg even advertised its staff by name. A bold strategy that sounds less like a hygiene service and more like a medieval boy band lineup. And business? Boo. Bathhouses that added brothel services saw a spike in profits, especially in larger cities like Paris, Prague and London. Travellers came for the water, stayed for the company. Locals winked knowingly when someone said they were just going for a soak. The term stew house itself became synonymous with vice. It didn't matter if your stew came with rosemary or with someone whispering sweet nothings in Old French. The association stuck. And yet, not all of these relationships were transactional in the traditional sense. Some bathhouse workers developed loyal clientele, regulars, confidence. It wasn't all lust and licentiousness. Sometimes, people just wanted to be seen, heard, touched, like actual humans, especially in a time when life was so brutal, so isolating, that a warm hand on your shoulder meant more than another sermon about eternal damnation. Of course, the church was livid. Again, clergy railed against the stew baths, calling them dens of iniquity, rivers of sin, naked theatres of the devil. One monk even wrote a full-length tirade about a bathhouse he claimed was so morally corrupt that birds refused to fly overhead. Dramatic, but points for creativity. Officials weren't far behind. Some cities shut down bathhouses entirely. Others split them in two. One half for real bathing, the other for, well, everything else. In some cases, these halves were separated by nothing more than a curtain or a stern warning sign that no one read. Despite the scandals, bathhouse workers became a unique social class. They weren't quite servants, not quite artisans, not exactly sex workers. They were somewhere in between, skilled in comfort, trusted with secrets, feared for their gossip potential, you tipped them well, or you ended up the subject of next week's town rumors. It's worth noting that many of these workers were women, and like so many women in history, they operated in the grey zones of power and vulnerability. Some were exploited, certainly, but others wielded influence over their clients, over information, over who got to rinse first and who had to wait. They may not have held titles, but they held something else, leverage. Still, things could get grim. The spread of disease, particularly syphilis, was closely tied to these hybrid bathhouses. Some cities posted warnings, others turned a blind eye. It was the price of pleasure, many believed, or at least the cost of pretending your problems could be steamed away for a few coins and a little company. But there were deeper consequences too. The bathhouse had once been a communal haven, a place for families, for healing, for simple comfort. As its reputation shifted, so did its clientele. Families stopped coming, the poor were edged out. What remained was a place less about washing and more about forgetting. And yet some places kept records, ledgers, notes. One infamous bathhouse in Augsburg maintained a guest book, a real physical logbook with names, dates, and services rendered. It was supposed to be for taxes. Instead, it became a relic, a diary of a society pretending not to know itself. One of the entries simply reads, "He came for warmth. He left lighter, paid in silver. Make of that what you will." The bathhouse, once a place of modest ritual, had become a mirror, showing not just who you were, but what you longed for: connection, comfort, escape, even if only for the length of a steam session and a borrowed towel. And yet, change was coming. Not moral panic, not censorship, something darker. A rat scurries beneath the bench, a cough echoes off the stone wall, and outside the doors of the stew bath, a new enemy gathers. Not sin, not lust, but something invisible, airborne, and very, very patient. One bathhouse kept a guest book. Let's just say it wasn't for Yelp reviews. You're lounging in a tub of gently reused bath water, flirting half-heartedly with someone who might be a baker or might be married. The steam is thick and so are the rumors. Then someone coughs. Not just a polite little throat clear, but a deep, chest-rattling harbinger of doom. You pause, you glance around, and then you notice the sores. Welcome to the 14th century. The bath is warm. The death rate is warmer. The Black Death didn't walk, it sprinted. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe lost roughly a third of its population. That's not hyperbole, that's statistical genocide. Entire villages disappeared. Cities fell silent. Fields went untilled, and in the midst of it all, bathhouses, once bubbling hives of gossip and groping, became ghost stories in progress. At first, no one knew what was happening. People fell ill seemingly at random. Buboes bloomed like deathly flowers. Fevers burned through households in days. And because science had not yet evolved beyond leeches and guesswork, panic filled the gaps. Naturally, the bathhouse, that communal cauldron of shared bodily fluids, came under suspicion. It made sense. People were dying in clusters, and what was more clustered than 20 semi-naked townsfolk soaking in the same warm broth? Physicians and clergy alike began warning against open pores, claiming that bathing made the body vulnerable, a kind of gateway for the plague to seep in. If you steamed too long, they said, your soul might leave the body, and something worse might enter. Whether this was true didn't matter. Fear spread faster than fleas. One bathhouse shut down, then two. Then entire cities banned public bathing altogether. Where once the town square rang with the sound of water being poured and hands being scrubbed, now there was only silence and the muffled coughing of someone trying not to be next. The economic fallout was immediate. Bathhouse owners closed up shop. Attendants were let go, some becoming beggars, others simply disappearing. Bathing, once a form of social currency, now became a liability. To bathe was to tempt fate. Better to stink and live than to risk a rinse and die. And so, people stopped. They stopped visiting the baths. They stopped washing. They closed windows. They burned herbs and carried posies and wore masks shaped like beaks because some guy named Guido thought it would keep the bad air away. Spoiler, it didn't. But the real tragedy wasn't just the filth. It was the loss of connection. The bathhouse had been a community centre, a rare space where people of different classes and lives came together. When that collapsed, so did something more intimate. The idea that we could be vulnerable together, that shared warmth meant shared humanity, crumbled beneath the weight of a death toll too massive to comprehend. Of course, people still tried. In some remote towns, bathhouses limped along, enforcing new rules. Fewer people per session, mandatory health checks, separate hours. But trust was broken. Where once you'd entered the bathhouse to relax, now you entered wondering who among your fellow bathers would be dead by week's end. And for the survivors, the psychological shift was profound. Bathing became taboo. Suspicious, dangerous. People began to equate cleanliness with illness, dirt with survival. Parents warned their children not to wash too often. Doctors recommended vinegar rinses, but never actual soaking. One widely circulated guide even suggested that you should avoid heavy breathing after a bath, lest your lungs become softened and penetrable. Because apparently even breathing was hazardous now. Meanwhile, abandoned bathhouses rotted, roofs collapsed, tubs filled with rainwater. Rats moved in, as if auditioning for the sequel. The once bustling stew houses became grim monuments to vulnerability, and to everything the plague had stolen. You might wonder, didn't anyone try to defend the practice? Of course. A few brave souls argued that hygiene could help, not harm, that maybe, just maybe, washing away filth wasn't a death wish. But those voices were drowned out by the sound of funeral bells. And the irony, the plague was spread not by baths, but by fleas, by rats, by poor sanitation and close living quarters. The very things that public bathing might have helped mitigate if understood correctly. But medieval science didn't run on logic, it ran on fear, religious guilt, and about 400 variations of maybe this toad will help. Still, not everyone abandoned the bath entirely. Nobles retreated to private bathing chambers, safer, sanitized relatively, and free of suspicious commoners. Monasteries, too, maintained their traditions, citing spiritual cleanliness as justification. But the communal bathhouse, that was done, dead as the apothecary who recommended steam as a cure. And so medieval Europe grew darker, dirtier, more isolated. The warm, humid spaces where people once relaxed became cautionary tales, whispered to children. Don't go there, they said. That's where it started. And just like that, being squeaky clean went out of style for centuries. But dirt wasn't just neglect, it was armor. Once the plague had swept through Europe like a cosmic broom dipped in despair, something shifted. Not just in society but in scent. Bathhouses boarded up. Soap grew dusty. And in place of cleanliness, a new philosophy emerged. Why wash at all? It wasn't just laziness. It was fear. Sharp, generational fear. People didn't trust water anymore. They didn't trust open pores, warm steam, or the idea that being naked in a room full of strangers wouldn't immediately summon divine punishment and a rash. Dirt, once considered a social embarrassment, became a kind of armor. If filth had protected the survivors, maybe it would protect you too. Doctors, that ever-trustworthy band of plague mask enthusiasts, helped seal the deal. Medical wisdom declared that frequent bathing opened up the skin to dangerous vapors. A bit like peeling a grape and then leaving it in a plague ward. Keep your pores closed, they warned. Seal your body from the bad airs. Water, they claimed, loosened the body's defenses. Clean skin was vulnerable skin. This led to a delightful paradox. The people who survived the most devastating public health crisis in European history responded by cancelling showers, and the elite, they ran with it. Nobles began to see dirt, not only as safe, but as fashionable. After all, if the peasants couldn't bathe, why should they? Never mind that they lived in castles with rooms dedicated to vanity. Suddenly, perfume wasn't just a scent, it was a substitute, a tactical strike against personal stench, layered heavily, reapplied hourly. If medieval France had a national smell, it was rosewater over mouldy velvet. Underclothes became the new battleground. Since people believed bathing was risky, they started changing their linens more frequently. The idea was that clean clothes would draw the filth from your skin. Like some sort of cotton-based exorcism, you could be covered in grime as long as your shirt was freshly laundered. Your soul was presumably fine. And what about the commoners? They adapted too. Bathing returned to the riverbank. Behind cottages, all was reduced to a splash and dash routine. But gone were the days of community bathing. You didn't want to risk it. Not with Cousin Tom still coughing and that weird sore on the baker's neck. Instead, people kept their distance. And their dirt. In many places, washing became associated with immorality again. A man who smelled too good was probably hiding something. A woman who bathed too often was frivolous. Children were scrubbed only when visibly crusty. And even then, only with cold water and suspicion. To be dirty was to be cautious. To be clean was to tempt fate. Royalty, however, continued to dabble in the occasional bath, if only because no amount of musky civet oil could fully mask a 3-week-old sweat. But even here, it was done sparingly. Queen Elizabeth I was rumoured to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not, and that was considered generous. And then of course there was Queen Isabella of Spain. Reportedly, she bathed exactly twice in her entire life, once when she was born, and once before her wedding. The end. This was not satire, this was a flex. But even filth has its limits. Eventually the sheer weight of stink began to wear people down. Diaries from the time speak of rooms so pungent they made guests faint, clothing so saturated with sweat it rotted, wigs so filthy they developed their own ecosystem. You can only pretend dirt is ginified for so long before your nose stages a revolt. And yet, through all of this, the idea persisted. Bathing was for the reckless, the vain, the immoral. You couldn't trust hot water anymore. It was decadent, effeminate, potentially fatal. Better to stay dry, smelly and alive. And as this mindset took hold, entire generations grew up believing that water was dangerous unless blessed, boiled or mixed with wine. Rivers were fine for fish and drownings, but not for humans. Rain was a punishment. And steam? That was for the Turkish, the sinful, or the foolhardy. The irony, of course, was bitter. Public health had improved in other ways. Cities were slowly developing better sewage systems, medicine was crawling toward modernity, and literacy was spreading. But in this one area, Europe regressed, choosing stink over science, rot over risk. But that regression wasn't permanent. Quietly in the shadows of abandoned bathhouses and perfumed parlours, a few brave souls kept the flame and the tub alive. They wrote about cleanliness, studied it, even, dare we say, practiced it. And over time, they would help usher in the return of the bath. But not yet. For now, the cities of Europe reeked with the musk of trauma, tradition, and tinctures that did absolutely nothing. So if you're ever feeling bad about skipping your shower, just remember, at least you don't believe hot water is a death sentence. Imagine you've just spent a couple centuries being told that bathing could kill you, that water opens your pores to invisible demons, that soap is suspicious, that cleanliness is a gateway drug to vanity, vanity a gateway to lust, and lust, well, you get the picture. And yet, somehow, here we are, the Renaissance, a glorious revival of classical art, architecture, and very cautiously, the idea that maybe washing your body doesn't mean you're summoning the Black Death. Slowly, nervously, Europe tiptoed back into the tub. It didn't happen overnight. Bathing's comeback was less a triumphant return and more of a quiet rebranding. People still feared public bathhouses. Those had been decimated by plague, paranoia, and moral purging. But private bathing, that was something else. Something controllable, something stylish. The wealthy led the charge, as usual. If the Middle Ages were about perfume-soaked rags and changing your undershirt until it disintegrated, the Renaissance elite took things one porcelain tub at a time. Wealthy households began installing elaborate bathtubs. Not built-in, of course, but movable wooden or metal vessels lined with cloth or tin. They were placed near fireplaces, surrounded by screens, and filled with water that was heated in kettles and carried in by servants who probably had much better things to do. But this time, it wasn't about survival. It was about ambiance. Bathing became a performance again. The tub was a throne. The bather, royalty. Even if they weren't technically royalty, candles were lit. Music was played. Sometimes poets were hired to compose verses, while the Lord scrubbed his toes. We're not kidding. The Renaissance was like that. Soap also saw a glow-up. Italy and southern France began producing high-quality soaps from olive oil and lye, scented with herbs and flowers, and shaped into decorative bars that looked more like pastries than hygiene products. A gift of soap became a gesture of class and refinement. A clean neck was now a sign of education, not moral bankruptcy. And let's talk about the science. The Renaissance didn't just revive Roman statues, it sparked a return to Roman ideas about health, including bathing. Scholars rediscovered classical texts that discussed the medical benefits of hydrotherapy. Physicians began cautiously recommending warm baths to balance humors and alleviate melancholy. It was still deeply wrong, medically speaking, but at least they'd moved beyond urine gargling. There was also the influence of other cultures. Europe, once isolated and spiritually constipated, had begun trading more with the Ottoman Empire and East Asia, both regions with rich bathing traditions. Turkish hammams and Japanese sento made European practices look frankly like crusty sad puddles. Exposure to these ideas helped nudge the continent toward the realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd been doing it wrong. But don't go thinking we were suddenly bathing daily. Oh no. Once a week, maybe? More often if you were sick, rich, or trying to seduce a duchess. The average person still got by with sponge baths, spot cleaning, and a lot of wishful thinking. Rural folks, especially, stuck to the river dunk or seasonal scrubbing method. Easter, maybe Christmas, and possibly your wedding day if your future in-laws had sensitive noses. Still, progress is progress. Even the church backed off a little. Now that bathing was done privately, under the discreet supervision of an underpaid servant and 3 layers of silk curtains, it was considered less sinful. Modesty had returned. And where there's modesty, there's approval. Public nakedness was still scandalous. Private nudity, as long as it was accompanied by prayer and a lavender sachet, was spiritually permissible. The elite, of course, took it to absurd heights. Renaissance bath rituals could take hours. Nobles reclined in perfumed water, while servants massaged their scalps with egg whites or rubbed their feet with crushed almonds. Some even had silver strainers to skim the surface of their bathwater for floating debris. Because heaven forbid a leaf touch your knee and remind you that nature exists. Artists got in on the trend too. Baths began appearing in paintings, usually as sensual, glowing sanctuaries filled with pale, demure ladies and no visible mold. These weren't depictions of daily life. They were aspirational, the Pinterest boards of their time. And while we're here, bathhouses didn't entirely vanish. In some cities, Florence, Venice, parts of Germany, they lingered, sanitized, secularized, and significantly more private. These Renaissance bathhouses were smaller and tamer. They offered massage, steaming and soaking, but the steamy escapades of yesteryear were mostly phased out, or at least hidden behind better doors. But the communal spirit? Gone. What was once a shared ritual had become an elite indulgence. You didn't bathe with people, you bathed above them, literally, on the second floor of your home. If you were rich enough to have floors, bathing had returned, but with class-based strings firmly attached. Still, it was a start. The Renaissance marked a turning point. The moment bathing crawled out of the plague pit and began its slow, bubbly climb toward normalization. It wasn't yet universal, or daily, or particularly sanitary by modern standards, but it was no longer heretical, no longer feared. Cleanliness had become chic again. Still with us? Then you, dear viewer, have earned a gold-plated loofah and maybe a like and subscribe, because while the Renaissance may have made bathing fashionable again, it also raised a new question. Who actually made it all possible? The ones who carried the buckets, scrubbed the floors, and vanished into the steam. Let's take a break from the candles and crushed almonds. Strip away the velvet robes, the scented oils, the silver strainer delicately skimming the bath water. Underneath all the Renaissance glamour, someone still had to heat the water. Someone had to scrub the tubs. Someone had to carry the waste out the back door and pretend it wasn't following them home. Enter the bathhouse workers, the invisible hands that made the whole operation possible and received approximately zero credit for it. These weren't high-status positions. You didn't dream of becoming a professional bucket hauler. No child looked longingly out their cottage window and whispered, "One day, I'll skim hair from the merchant's tub with dignity." Most bathhouse staff were poor, often women, sometimes children, sometimes formerly enslaved people or serfs trying to piece together a living in a society that barely noticed them. Their jobs were brutal. First, there was the water. It had to be hauled in, often bucket by bucket from rivers, wells, or municipal fountains. That water then had to be heated in massive cauldrons. stirred over open flames in smoky, half-ventilated rooms. The firewood was heavy, the pots were heavier, the burns frequent. If you were lucky, the worst you got was a splash of scalding water to the shin. If you weren't, you learned to love the smell of singed linen. Then there was the cleaning. Every surface in a bathhouse collected something: steam, soot, hair, skin flakes, mysterious puddles. Tubs needed scrubbing with stiff brushes and ash or sand. Towels needed to be rinsed rarely, wrung out, and hung up to dry in damp corners where they would almost certainly develop a personality of their own. Oh, and guess what? There were no gloves, no safety protocols. Just raw hands, raw soap, and raw sewage. Attendants were also expected to maintain the mood. In the higher-end bathhouses, they became part hospitality, part therapist, part improvisational actor. If a client wanted quiet, they provided silence. If a client wanted gossip, they offered stories. If a client wanted a massage, they knelt beside the tub and rubbed someone's feet, while pretending they didn't just hear a rat squeak behind the curtain. Some workers were trained in basic hygiene techniques: how to mix herbs for sore muscles, how to apply poultices, how to keep someone's face from falling off mid-scrub. Others were trained in diplomacy: how to fend off drunk nobles without causing offense, how to keep married clients from running into each other in the hallway, how to disappear entirely when things got awkward. And yet, despite their skill, most were barely paid. A few coins here, a crust of bread there, occasionally a tip if the client was wealthy or unusually grateful, but mostly they were background characters. Necessary, but forgettable, like the steam present in every scene, fading into the walls. It wasn't all hardship. Some workers formed friendships with regulars. Others used their positions to gain social leverage, overhearing secrets, gathering gossip, becoming confidantes. A clever bathhouse attendant could learn a lot: who was in debt, who was cheating, who was climbing the social ladder too fast for comfort. Information, after all, was its own kind of currency. Still, the risks were constant. Disease, injury, harassment. The worker could spend all day immersed in heat and humidity, only to catch pneumonia from the chill when stepping outside. Some suffered from respiratory problems after years inhaling smoke and steam. Others developed skin conditions from constant contact with harsh soaps and strangers' body oils. And when the bathhouse doubled as a brothel, which many did, the line between staff and entertainment could blur dangerously. Some workers were coerced into performing services they hadn't signed up for. Others joined willingly, seeing it as more lucrative than hauling buckets. But consent was rarely clean, and protections were non-existent. Even so, the bathhouse kept turning because of them. The noble could recline in his perfumed bath because someone else spent 2 hours hauling water. The merchant's wife could receive her floral hair rinse because someone crushed those petals by hand and strained them through cloth that had seen too much. But you won't find their names in the records. Bathhouse workers were seldom mentioned in city ledgers or letters. When they were, it was often in the form of fines for lateness, for misconduct, for undignified behavior, which frankly feels like a bold accusation from someone relaxing in a communal soup bowl. Still, some echoes remain. In a ledger from 4083, one entry simply reads, "Paid 2 pence to Marta who carried the buckets and did not complain." That's it. No surname, no legacy. Just 2 pence, and the faint acknowledgement that Marta showed up, did her work, and held the entire soggy structure together without making a fuss. So, next time you picture a medieval bathhouse, the flickering torchlight, the echoing laughter, the warm water sloshing in hand-carved tubs, remember the people behind the scenes. The ones who lived in the heat, cleaned in the cold, and disappeared when the guests arrived. Imagine spending your whole life helping others get clean, and never quite being seen. So far, we've been waist-deep in medieval Europe's unique relationship with bathing. The paranoia, the perfume, the bathwater you could bounce a spoon off. But here's the twist. While Europe was nervously sniffing itself and hoping dirt counted as a spiritual shield, other parts of the world had already figured it out. Turns out, not everyone thought soap was suspicious or that water was whispering temptations into their pores. Let's begin with the Romans. Because everything begins with the Romans. They weren't medieval, but their shadow stretched far. Ancient Roman bathhouses were engineering marvels. hypercaust systems for heated floors, sophisticated aqueducts for water delivery, and so many fountains that modern spa resorts look like glorified puddles by comparison. These baths weren't just for hygiene, they were social epic centers, places to gossip, exercise, read poetry, and occasionally wrestle in the nude, as one does. Now jump to the Ottomans. While European bathhouses were turning into haunted steam dens of moral dread, the Ottoman Empire was perfecting the hammam. These Turkish baths were based on Roman principles, but infused with Islamic purification practices. Cleanliness was a religious obligation, not a vanity project. The hammam was a spiritual reset, a sacred act tied to ritual purity, and it showed. You entered a sequence of rooms, cold, warm and hot, like a sauna tour designed by someone with obsessive attention to skin temperature. Attendants washed you, massaged you, and exfoliated you until you emerged less like a human and more like a freshly peeled grape. It wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about renewal. And here's the kicker, they were clean. Actual effort was made to change water, scrub floors, and maintain air circulation. The hammam was a place of discipline and grace, not just steamy chaos and communal fungal roulette. Meanwhile, in Japan, bathing had been taken to near-artistic levels centuries earlier. The Japanese onsen hot springs and Santo public bathhouses formed a cornerstone of daily life. Here, bathing wasn't communal stew, it was ritual precision. You washed yourself before entering the tub, thoroughly, respectfully, no debris allowed. The bath was for soaking, not scrubbing. Water temperature mattered. Behavior mattered. Cleanliness wasn't just physical, it was behavioral. The entire process was meditative, structured, and respectful. You didn't talk loudly, you didn't splash, you didn't bring your drama into the tub unless you were prepared to stare quietly at your reflection and reconsider every life choice that led you there. And people bathed often, daily if possible, because they wanted to, because it felt good, because it didn't come wrapped in moral panic and a side of lice. India had its own traditions too. In Hindu culture, bathing in rivers like the Ganges was, and remains, a spiritual act, believed to purify the soul. Ritual bathing was part of daily routines, festivals, and rites of passage. And while the hygiene science didn't always align, the Ganges, beautiful though it is, has its microbial issues. The intention was clear. Cleansing wasn't indulgence, it was devotion. Even the Mongols, notoriously mobile, minimally clothed, and rarely credited for personal grooming, had sweat lodges. They understood the value of steam, of detoxification, of pausing to let your pores breathe before galloping off to conquer half of Eurasia. In Africa, traditional bathing practices varied by region. In some areas, people bathed communally in rivers with handmade soap from ash and plant oils. In others, steam huts were used for cleansing and healing, especially after childbirth or illness. Bathing was woven into rhythms of life tied to the seasons, to ritual, to health. And in the Americas? The Aztecs had the temazcal, a kind of sweat lodge used for both physical purification and spiritual rebirth. You crawled into a low, stone chamber. Steam rose from volcanic stones. Herbs filled the air. You sweated, you prayed, you emerged cleaner in every sense. It was therapy before therapy was invented. All of which makes Europe look a little awkward. While much of the world had embraced bathing as healing, sacred, or even joyful, Europe spent centuries nervously dabbing its armpits with rosewater and hoping the neighbours didn't notice the smell. They had the Roman legacy, sure, but they buried it under layers of religious shame, plague-induced panic, and genuinely terrible architecture. So what happened? Well, Europe got scared. Then it got sanctimonious. Then it got confused. It was a perfect storm of bad science, worse theology, and deeply conflicting social codes. When the rest of the world was soaking in bliss, Europe was moralizing mildly. To be fair, there were exceptions. Southern Italy and Spain, closer to Islamic influence, held on to better hygiene traditions longer. Trade with the East brought back ideas, slowly. And as the Renaissance trickled forward, curiosity bloomed. Europe didn't invent the bath, but it was starting to remember it hadn't always been afraid of water. And really that's the tragic irony. Because while medieval Europeans thought they were being virtuous by avoiding baths, other cultures knew better. Knew that bathing wasn't weakness. That to clean oneself was to honor the body. That warmth, water, and stillness could be tools of transformation, not just venues for gossip and the occasional public indecency charge. When the rest of the world was soaking in bliss, why was Europe busy moralizing mildew? Close your eyes. You're standing at the threshold of a medieval bathhouse. The door creaks open, wood swollen from centuries of steam and secrets. And then, it hits you. Not the smell, that comes later. First, the sound. It's not silence. It's never silence. The bathhouse breathes. It murmurs. It hums. Dripping water strikes stone in steady, measured rhythms. Plink, 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 the metronome of medieval relaxation. Somewhere deeper in, water boils in great iron pots, bubbling with the enthusiasm of a potion gone slightly wrong. And between the burbles and hisses, the voices begin to emerge. Men laugh, women argue, children splash. A lute twangs in the corner, slightly out of tune, played by a musician who's clearly been paid in soup and regrets. There's singing, off-key and enthusiastic, and the occasional bark of a bath attendant telling someone to keep their elbows to themselves. The bathhouse has an echo, soft and rounded, like every word has been wrapped in wool before bouncing back. You can hear whispered confessions, the slap of wet flesh on polished bench, and the unmistakable thump of someone slipping, followed by a chorus of groans and chuckles. This place has its own language spoken in steam. And then the smell. It arrives like a wave, not aggressive, but insistent. A base layer of wet wood and warm stone. Then something herbal, thyme, maybe mint, tossed into the water with a prayer, and a handful of apothecary dust. A trace of wine, a sharper tang, unwashed humanity, mingled with soap that's doing its best. Someone nearby has used rosewater, too much of it. Another has clearly skipped the soap altogether, relying on the old heat and hope method. The air is thick, saturated. Every breath tastes like history filtered through a damp rag. You step inside. Your foot meets the floor, slick, uneven, faintly slimy. The stone is warm, the moisture clinging to your soles. You move slowly. No one hurries here. The heat saps urgency. It's like time dilates in the bathhouse. Minutes stretch, thoughts slow, expectations soften. You walk past a row of benches. On one, an old woman peels an onion, not to eat, but because she believes the steam helps with her arthritis. On another, a couple whisper nothings that sound suspiciously like somethings. A child darts between them, naked, squealing with delight, chased by a mother trying to wash his hair with one hand, while holding a bar of soap that keeps escaping like a greased piglet. And finally the water. It's not crystal clear. This isn't a Renaissance painting. It's cloudy, dense with oils, sweat, residue from the bodies that came before you. It shimmers in the candlelight, casting golden ripples on the walls. It smells like effort. It feels like surrender. You lower yourself in. The heat wraps around you like an over-enthusiastic aunt. It presses against your skin, seeps into your muscles, fogs your thoughts. For a moment, you forget the cold world outside, the taxes, the fleas, the endless labor. Here, there is only warmth, only the sound of your own breath rising and falling in sync with the room. Then comes touch. The brush of a stranger's knee. The rough drag of a linen rag across your back, offered by someone who doesn't ask your name. A hand that adjusts your towel. A foot that taps yours by accident. Or maybe not. Physical boundaries dissolve in the steam. Intimacy becomes communal. Your body is no longer a private object, but part of a warm, wet chorus of humanity. Let that sink in. This isn't sterile. It isn't polished. It's messy. It's damp. It's absurd. And yet, it works. There's comfort here, raw, flawed, and deeply human. In a world defined by hierarchy, the bathhouse is one of the only places where everyone is equally naked, equally pruny, equally ridiculous. Even your ears adjust. The first rush of sound fades into texture, the splash of ladles, the scrape of stone bowls against wet benches, the soft thunk of a bucket being set down, the laugh of someone telling a joke that's too old to be funny and too familiar not to be, and the steam. The steam is everywhere. It curls around your face, clings to your eyelashes, fogs your vision, until the room is a watercolor blur. Light bends through it. Shapes move, like ghosts. There's no sharpness here. Everything is softened. Bodies, edges, time itself. You could fall asleep here. Many do. The bathhouse doesn't ask for your best self. It doesn't care about your status, your debt, your flaws. It asks only that you sit, that you soak, that you be. Close your eyes, hear the drip, smell the smoke, feel the steam, breathe in the centuries. And as you do, you begin to understand why people came here. Not just to clean, but to feel something. Warmth, weightlessness. The sense, however fleeting, that for this moment, nothing else matters. Until someone splashes you directly in the face with a bucket of lukewarm water and laughs. Some things never change. Her name is Maren. She smells like lye soap, boiled linen, and the faint iron tang of worn-out copper coins. She's a widow, a washerwoman, and a regular at the local bathhouse. Not because she likes it, but because her hands are so cracked from scrubbing other people's clothes, that sometimes the steam is the only thing that stops them from bleeding. It's a Thursday evening in a modest town, the kind with muddy streets and thatched rooftops that leak when they feel like it. Maren's shift ended an hour ago, and she spent that hour collecting her payment. 2 eggs, half a loaf of coarse rye, and a promise that next week the tailor will actually pay her in coin. She steps into the bathhouse just after sunset, joining the slow shuffle of bodies moving like pilgrims towards salvation. If salvation came with questionable towels and a healthy chance of athlete's foot, her feet ache, her back is sore, and her mind is a tangled mess of bills, unpaid, and neighbors unkind. Inside, the heat swells. The familiar aroma greets her. Steam, wood smoke, dried rosemary crushed into the water by some optimistic apprentice. And beneath that, people, their sweat, their chatter, their collective hope that tonight's bath will rinse off more than just the grime. Maren undresses quickly, efficiently. There's no modesty here. Not really. Not when you've spent most of your life elbow deep in strangers' underthings. She wraps herself in a linen sheet that's seen better decades and steps onto the slick stone floor, navigating puddles and benches with the grace of someone who's done this too many times to slip. She finds her usual corner near the hot pipe, far from the entrance, away from the gossiping midwives who always seem to have something to say about her dark moods. She lowers herself into the tub, the water stinging her cracked hands, her knotted calves, the sore spot behind her right shoulder where grief lives rent-free. The water's already been used. That's obvious. But it's warm. And that's enough. Across from her, a young couple whispers, giggling behind their shared towel. To her left, an old man snores openly, one leg dangling out of the water like a forgotten sausage. Further down the bath, a woman combs lice from her daughter's hair, flicking the tiny bodies into a waiting bowl with a precision that could only come from love or sheer necessity. Maren closes her eyes, and for a moment she disappears. She's not poor, not tired, not alone. She's floating, weightless, soothed by warmth that asks nothing from her. The laughter fades into background music. The slosh of a bucket is just percussion, the hiss of steam, a lullaby. But peace never lasts long. There's a commotion near the door, raised voices, the clatter of something dropped. Maren opens one eye to see 2 men arguing, both red-faced, both trying to occupy the same basin. She sighs. The bathhouse attendant, a girl barely old enough to have eyebrows, intervenes with a ladle and a frown. The men grumble. Order resumes. Maren lets her head sink lower, water brushing her chin. She listens. "Did you hear?" one woman says near the wall. The blacksmith's wife caught her husband with the stew maid. "No." "Yes. Right here, last Tuesday. Thought the steam would hide them." Maren knows the blacksmith. He once gave her a copper coin for repairing his apron. She files the scandal away, not because she cares, but because bathhouse gossip is the town's only functioning postal system. Then, a tickle. Not a metaphorical one, a real one. On her ankle. She jerks her leg back. Too late. The thing's already moved. Lice, worm, lost ring, whatever it is, it's gone. She pretends it didn't happen. Everyone pretends. It's part of the bathhouse pact. Don't ask. Don't flinch. Don't identify the floating object. She exhales. The air thickens. She's sweating now. The kind of deep, pulsing sweat that feels like something being exercised. And then, she thinks of Jacob, her husband. Dead. 3 winters now. Slipped on ice. Hit his head. Gone by morning. He used to meet her here after work. They'd sneak glances through the steam, fingers brushing under the water like teenagers, even after 10 years of marriage. He once carved her name into a bench. It's still there, somewhere under the mold. She misses him. And that, more than the heat, more than the noise, begins to loosen her mind, heart, jaw. A tear mixes with the sweat on her cheek. No one notices. That's the magic of the bathhouse. No one sees your grief, unless you want them to. She turns to leave, wrinkled, wilted, but softer somehow. But when Maren steps out of the water, she doesn't know what she's about to lose. Her shift the next morning will begin with the news. A rash on the butcher's boy. A cough in the baker's wife. A rumour that someone fainted after soaking too long. By week's end, the bathhouse will be closed. Boarded up. Fear. She'll return, days later, standing at the sealed door, the steamless silence pressing on her like a second skin. She'll remember the water, the weightlessness, and wonder if she should have stayed just a little longer. Picture this. You wake up in your 21st century apartment, stretch your limbs, shuffle into your bathroom, private, tiled, scented like lavender and mass-manufactured serenity, and turn on a tap. Hot water pours out like magic. No fire, no ladles, no stew of human soup, just glorious on-demand cleanliness. Now imagine telling a medieval peasant about this. They'd think you were a wizard, or lying, or both. But that little morning ritual, your 5-minute shower, your waterproof Bluetooth speaker, is the end result of a long, weird, steamy evolution. Because once upon a time, bathing was communal, intimate, messy, and now it's solitary, sterile, and scented with sandalwood. So how exactly did we go from public stew pots to bathtubs with mood lighting? Well, the short version is plague, paranoia, plumbing. Let's rewind to the early modern period. After the Black Death, public bathhouses fell out of favour like yesterday's sour ale. People were convinced that water opened the body to disease, and they weren't entirely wrong, considering what was floating in those basins. The bathhouse, once the town square in a towel, was now viewed as a pestilential piranha tank. Wealthy elites began to distance themselves from communal hygiene. Quite literally, enter the private tub. At first, these were not the marble, claw-footed wonders of Victorian luxury. No, they were glorified barrels, sometimes even lined with sheets to keep the wood from splinters, because nothing ruins a good soak like a surprise splinter to the thigh. Water was hauled in by servants, heated over fire, poured bucket by bucket into a personal basin. It took hours to prepare, but oh, the status it implied. "Look at me," it whispered. "I can afford to get clean, alone." But not everyone could keep up with this VIP hygiene. The poor, especially in urban areas, had neither the space nor the resources for a bathtub, which is why many still relied on public fountains, river dips, or, let's be honest, not bathing at all. Meanwhile, those with wealth began designing their homes around the concept of privacy. Bedrooms became sanctuaries. Bathrooms, previously non-existent as a concept, began to form. By the 18th century, we start seeing actual plumbing innovations. Lead pipes, water tanks, indoor basins. It's still a mess by modern standards, but it's progress. The bathhouse by now is a relic, or a scandal, if it's still operating. Then the 19th century hits like a bar of carbolic soap to the face. This is the age of invention, of sanitation reformers, of people like Sir Edwin Chadwick, who basically went around yelling, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't live in filth." Suddenly, clean water becomes a public health goal. Indoor plumbing becomes a thing, and the bathroom, once a laughable luxury, starts entering middle-class homes like an awkward dinner guest no one wants to talk about, but everyone knows is important. Bathtubs evolve too. First copper, then enamel-coated cast iron, then porcelain, and then, in a design leap no one asked for, avocado green and pink pastel in the 1970s. But we digress. By the 20th century, private bathrooms are the norm in many developed countries. Showers, flush toilets, towels that aren't shared by 12 people. The idea of bathing with strangers becomes, well, weird, awkward, possibly illegal. Public bathhouses don't disappear entirely, but they become niche. Some survive in cultural traditions. Turkish hammams, Japanese sento, Scandinavian saunas. These are the spiritual descendants of the medieval bathhouse. Cleaner, yes, but still communal, still social, still, in some strange way, human. But for most of us, hygiene becomes a solo sport. You bathe alone, you exfoliate alone, you sing off-key 90s ballads alone while shampooing your scalp. And if anyone catches you in your bathroom, it's either a serious emergency or a cat who's decided your naked ankles are fair game. And here's the thing. It works. We're cleaner. We smell better. We don't share foot fungus with the blacksmith's apprentice. But in gaining privacy, we lost something else. We lost ritual. We lost community. The bathhouse wasn't just a place to wash. It was a place to talk, to unwind, to gather. It was where secrets were whispered, where marriages were arranged, where grudges were aired and occasionally resolved with a slap and a splash. It was messy, yes, but it was deeply human. Now, we bathe in silence. We lock the door. We emerge clean, but alone. Let that sink in, alongside your drain hair. We've traded the chaos of the bathhouse for the calm of the en-suite. And maybe that's a good thing. But maybe, just maybe, there's something to be said for the steam, the laughter, the shared discomfort. For the idea that once, not so long ago, getting clean meant coming together. So next time you turn on your tap, maybe take a second to thank the medieval stew pots. They walked barefoot, wet, slightly infected, so you could run your bath with essential oils and a curated playlist. Let's end where we started, naked, damp, and wondering what it all meant. Because sure, medieval bathhouses were gross. They were steamy dens of sweat, sin, and suspect water quality. But they were also something else. Something we don't talk about nearly enough. They were human. Strip away the mildew, the lice, the occasional syphilitic surprise, and what you're left with is a space where people came together, not in armor, not in status, but in skin, in softness, in shared heat. And that matters. In the modern world, we bathe alone. We call it self-care. We buy scented candles and talk to no one, which is fine until it's not. 'Cause sometimes solitude is just loneliness with better branding. Bathhouses, the real ones, the raw ones, weren't about perfection. They were about presence. They were about sitting elbow to elbow with your neighbor, awkwardly avoiding eye contact while your knees touched under the water. They were about being vulnerable without needing to explain it. And that vulnerability, that's rare now. We live in a world of curated avatars and filtered reflections. We present clean faces to the public, while hiding the parts of ourselves that feel messy. Too much. Not enough. Back then, your flaws floated right to the surface, and no one judged. They had their own. A wart, a scar, a story. In the bathhouse, dignity didn't come from appearance. It came from showing up. That's not to say bathhouses were utopias. Far from it. They were noisy, chaotic, sometimes exploitative. But they were also democratic in a way few places ever are. You could be poor, smelly, heartbroken, and still have a place in the steam. That's the part we've forgotten. Now, dignity is tied to wealth, to status, to privacy. We build bigger bathrooms, but feel smaller inside them. We spend more time alone and call it freedom. But maybe, just maybe, we're missing something communal, something essential. What if the thing we've been craving all along wasn't another product or another privacy upgrade? What if it was permission? Permission to be seen, truly seen, without pretense, without shame. Just skin and steam and stories. Bathhouses gave that. They said, come as you are. Bring your dirt, your laughter, your sorrow. There's water enough for all of it. And that invitation, that matters more now than it ever did. Because in the age of echo chambers and digital walls, we're lonelier than ever. We crave connection, but fear vulnerability. We swipe and scroll, curate and crop, but rarely allow ourselves to be messy in public. Bathhouses didn't give you a choice. They said undress, get in, everyone's weird here. And that's beautiful. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity, the floating buckets, the shouting monks, the stew-like viscosity of the water. But behind the humor there's a deeper truth. To bathe together was to say, I see you, and I'm not looking away. So what's the modern equivalent? Maybe it's a community center, a protest, a group therapy circle, Or maybe it's just choosing not to edit your grief before showing it. Maybe it's allowing yourself to be honest with someone, even if it's ugly, even if it's raw, because that's what dignity really is. It's not about looking clean, it's about being whole. Mud, floors, laughter, and all. And bathhouses, for all their filth and drama, understood that. So the next time you step into your sterile, silent shower, maybe pause. Remember Marin, the washerwoman. Remember the boy who sang too loudly and got banned. Remember the couple who whispered secrets through steam. They lived. They touched. They soaked. And so can you, metaphorically at least. Breathe in. Let it settle. Because beneath all the soap and sarcasm, this wasn't a story about medieval hygiene. It was a story about us. About what we share, what we hide, and what we might rediscover if we dared to open the door, shed our armor, and step into the water. If you're still here, consider this your honorary soapstone. Subscribe for more stories from history's dirtier corners. We'll keep digging so you don't have to. Whether you're listening in the bath or trying to fall asleep, thanks for letting us scrub a little grime off the past. Until next time, stay weird, stay curious, stay cleanish.